The smell of roasted turkey filled my parents' dining room in suburban Denver, but the warmth I felt as a kid during Christmas dinner had long since vanished. I sat at the far end of the mahogany table watching my family pass around dishes while discussing their latest accomplishments. My mother Margaret beamed as she described her supposedly thriving catering business, while my father Frank nodded proudly, claiming his recent promotion had transformed their financial situation. Aunts and uncles praised their success, completely unaware of the truth I'd been hiding for 3 years. When Uncle Richard asked about my own career prospects, Margaret's smile turned cold. "Stop begging for money," she announced loudly, her voice carrying across the silent room. "It's embarrassing." Every head turned toward me as she continued her performance. "Connor constantly asks us for help, and frankly, we're tired of supporting a grown man who can't manage his own life." The entire family nodded in agreement, their faces showing a mixture of pity and disapproval. I smiled, calmly reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. "Sarah," I said when my bank manager answered. "Freeze account final 27. The room fell completely silent. My parents' faces drained of color as I ended the call. The liars were about to expose themselves, and this Christmas dinner was about to become unforgettable. 3 years earlier, my life changed forever when Microsoft acquired my tech startup for $12 million. I'd spent 4 years developing cybersecurity software in my cramped apartment, surviving on ramen noodles and determination. The acquisition happened so quietly that only my lawyer and accountant knew the true amount. I deliberately kept the news from everyone, including my girlfriend Jessica, because I wanted to observe how people treated me when they thought I had nothing. What I discovered broke my heart in ways I never expected. My parents had been struggling with their mortgage payments, facing foreclosure within 60 days. Without telling anyone, I created a shell company called Denver Property Solutions and anonymously paid off their entire $240,000 mortgage. The relief on my mother's face when she received the mysterious inheritance letter was worth every penny. But then something disturbing happened. Instead of expressing gratitude for their miraculous fortune, my parents began fabricating elaborate stories about their sudden financial turnaround. Frank started telling neighbors he'd received a massive promotion at his construction management job, complete with details about overseeing major commercial projects. Margaret claimed her catering business had landed several high-profile corporate contracts. They bought new furniture, upgraded their kitchen appliances, and began hosting elaborate family gatherings to showcase their apparent success. Meanwhile, I continued living in my modest apartment, driving my 10-year-old Honda Civic and working various part-time jobs to maintain the illusion of financial struggle. The deception deepened when my sister Katie needed $50,000 for her dream wedding. I anonymously covered every expense through a fake wedding planning grant program I created. Katie and her husband Brad believed they'd won a contest they never remembered entering. When my brother Tommy required emergency surgery for a herniated disc, I paid his $38,000 medical bill through a charitable foundation that supposedly helped construction workers. Tommy spent months praising the generosity of strangers while never suspecting his own brother had saved his family from bankruptcy. Each anonymous gift required careful planning to avoid detection. I hired actors to pose as representatives from various organizations, created fake websites for fictional companies, and even rented office spaces to make my charitable fronts appear legitimate. The elaborate schemes cost me an additional $100,000 in operational expenses, but watching my family's relief made every dollar worthwhile. However, the most painful part wasn't the money I spent. It was listening to my parents take credit for achievements they never earned while simultaneously treating me like a failure who couldn't contribute anything meaningful to the family. Frank would lecture me about financial responsibility during every family gathering, offering unsolicited advice about budgeting and career advancement. Margaret would sigh dramatically whenever I mentioned struggling to make ends meet, often commenting that she didn't understand why I couldn't follow their example of success. The breaking point came during Tommy's birthday party last spring, when Frank stood up to toast his own generous spirit, claiming he'd personally helped Tommy through his medical crisis. Margaret nodded proudly, adding that their family's financial stability allowed them to support relatives in need. Every person at that table believed my parents were pillars of strength and wisdom, while I sat quietly in the corner, branded as the family disappointment who needed constant assistance. That night I realized my secret generosity had created a monster. My parents weren't just hiding their dependence on my support. They were actively building their reputations on lies while destroying mine. The anonymous gifts I'd intended as expressions of love had become foundations for deception that grew more elaborate with each passing month. As I sat at this Christmas dinner table watching Frank gesture proudly while describing his latest fictional business triumph, I knew the time had come to reveal the truth. My phone call to Sarah wasn't just about freezing an account. It was about dismantling 3 years of carefully constructed lies that had poisoned every family relationship I valued. The next few hours would either destroy my family or finally force them to confront the reality they'd been avoiding since the day I secretly saved them from losing everything they owned. The silence following my phone call lasted exactly 17 seconds before chaos erupted throughout the house. Katie's husband Brad was the first to break the spell when his phone buzzed with an urgent notification from their mortgage company. His face went white as he read the message aloud. Payment declined. Account insufficient funds. Contact immediately to avoid late fees. Tommy's wife Linda gasped when her phone displayed a similar alert about their health insurance premium bouncing. That's impossible, she whispered frantically, scrolling through their banking app. The automatic payment was supposed to go through this morning. Her confusion quickly turned to panic as she realized their account contained only $14.63. Uncle Richard excused himself to answer a call from someone identifying themselves as a representative from Mountain West Business Loans. Through the thin dining room walls, we could hear his increasingly agitated voice asking about a co-signer named Frank Peterson and why their monthly payment had been rejected. When he returned to the table, his face showed the kind of bewilderment reserved for people whose reality had just shifted beneath their feet. My cousin Amanda, a junior at Colorado State University, discovered her spring semester tuition payment had failed to process. The email from the bursar's office informed her that her enrollment status would change to inactive unless the $8,200 balance was resolved within 72 hours. She looked across the table at Frank and Margaret with growing alarm, remembering their promise to help with her education expenses. I watched this domino effect unfold while calmly cutting my turkey, occasionally glancing at my parents who sat frozen in their chairs like deer caught in headlights. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for her wine glass while Frank's jaw muscles worked overtime as he processed the implications of what was happening. "You want to know something interesting about family finances?" I said, setting down my fork and pulling out a tablet from my jacket pocket. "I've been keeping detailed records of every expense, every payment, and every financial transaction affecting this family for the past 3 years." I swiped through several spreadsheets, each one color-coded and meticulously organized. "Would anyone like to see where your money actually came from?" The room fell silent again as I began reading from my records. Katie's wedding expenses, $50,237, paid by Denver Property Solutions on March 15, 2021. Tommy's medical bills, $38,612, covered by the Colorado Construction Workers Relief Fund on August 9, 2021. Property taxes for Frank and Margaret Peterson, $7,940 annually automatically deducted from the Peterson Family Trust. With each revelation, family members looked more confused and frightened. I continued scrolling through my documentation, revealing the intricate web of financial support I'd been providing while everyone believed my parents were the family's financial backbone. Margaret's catering equipment loan, $15,000. Uncle Richard's business expansion capital, $22,000. Amanda's college expenses, $36,000 over 2 years. Every single payment traced back to accounts I established and funded. I looked up to see my mother hyperventilating while Frank loosened his tie, sweat beading on his forehead despite the December cold outside. Katie finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. Connor, what are you saying? Mom and Dad told us their business was doing incredibly well. They said Dad's promotion covered everything. I laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Margaret's catering business hasn't booked a legitimate client in 8 months. Her equipment sits unused in the garage while she creates fictional success stories. Frank's construction company laid him off 18 months ago, but he's been leaving the house every morning and sitting in coffee shops all day pretending to go to work. The accusation hit Frank like a physical blow. He started to stand up, probably to defend himself, but Margaret grabbed his arm and pulled him back down. Her eyes were wide with terror as she realized their carefully constructed facade was crumbling in real time. The Peterson family mortgage was 3 months behind when I paid it off. I continued, my voice remaining steady despite the emotional storm building inside me. You were 60 days from foreclosure when Denver Property Solutions mysteriously appeared with a full payoff offer. That company exists solely on paper, funded entirely by my Microsoft acquisition. Linda started crying when she understood that their family's financial stability for the past 3 years had been an elaborate illusion. Tommy put his arm around her shoulders, but his own face showed the dawning realization that everything they'd believed about their lives was a carefully orchestrated lie. Uncle Richard set his phone down with shaking hands. The business loan representative wants to speak with Frank immediately. They said the co-signer account has been frozen and they need alternative payment arrangements by tomorrow morning. Margaret finally spoke, her voice cracking with desperation. Connor, sweetheart, I think there's been some terrible misunderstanding. Your father and I have worked very hard to build our financial security. We've never asked you for anything. I smiled at her attempt to maintain the charade, even as it collapsed around her. Final 27 wasn't just a code to freeze your support account, Mom. It was also a signal to activate the recording system I've been using to document every conversation in this house for the past 18 months. The color drained completely from both my parents' faces as I tapped my tablet screen. Their own voices began playing through the device's speakers, clear recordings of conversations they'd had when they thought I was out of earshot. Discussions about maintaining their lies, manipulating family members, and taking credit for generosity they'd never shown. Christmas dinner had officially become a reckoning, and we hadn't even reached dessert. The sound of my parents' recorded voices discussing their deception strategies created an atmosphere so tense that nobody dared move. Margaret's face had gone from pale to a sickly gray color as she listened to herself explaining to Frank how they needed to keep Connor believing he was a burden, while secretly depending on his financial support. Turn that off. Frank finally managed to say, his voice hoarse with panic. Connor, we need to talk privately about this situation. I paused the recording and looked directly at my father. Actually, Dad, I think it's time for complete honesty with everyone here, especially since you and Mom have been busy creating some additional problems that affect more than just our family. Margaret started shaking her head frantically, clearly understanding where this conversation was headed. Her attempts to signal Frank went unnoticed as he struggled to process the magnitude of what was unfolding. 3 months ago, I continued, I received an interesting call from a credit monitoring service. Apparently, someone had been using my social security number to apply for various loans and credit cards. When I investigated, I discovered applications for 3 different credit cards, a personal loan from Rocky Mountain Credit Union, and a line of credit from First National Bank. All in my name, all approved, and all maxed out. Katie gasped audibly while Tommy leaned forward, his face showing growing alarm. Uncle Richard muttered something under his breath that sounded like profanity. The total amount of debt accumulated in my name comes to $68,437. Every single application used forged signatures that someone had been practicing for months based on the progression I could see in the handwriting analysis. Margaret broke down completely. At this point, tears streaming down her face as she realized their crimes were being exposed in front of the entire family. Frank tried to maintain his composure, but his hands were visibly shaking as he reached for his water glass. Margaret and Frank thought they were being clever, I explained to my shocked relatives. They assumed I was too financially irresponsible to monitor my credit reports. They figured I'd never discover their activities because they'd successfully convinced everyone I was a failure who didn't pay attention to important matters. Linda spoke up, her voice filled with disbelief. Are you saying your own parents committed identity theft? Before I could answer, Katie interrupted with a confession that stunned everyone at the table. I knew about the credit cards, she whispered, not making eye contact with anyone. Mom told me about them 6 months ago. She said Connor had asked them to help him establish better credit, and they were co-signers helping him learn financial responsibility. The revelation that Katie had known about the identity theft while continuing to accept my anonymous financial support created another layer of betrayal that hit me harder than my parents' crimes. My sister hadn't just remained silent about felony activities. She'd participated in maintaining the lies that enabled them. Tommy's wife, Linda, then made her own devastating admission. I've been lying too, she said through tears. The medical emergencies for Jackson weren't always real. Sometimes I exaggerated his symptoms or made up doctor visits to get Connor to help with our bills. Margaret suggested it, saying Connor responded better to family crises than direct requests for money. The table erupted in shocked conversations as family members began questioning everything they thought they knew about each other. Uncle Richard demanded to know if anyone else had been manipulating Connor's generosity, while Amanda stared at her grandparents with complete disillusionment. Frank finally found his voice, though it came out as a desperate whisper. Connor, son, you have to understand the pressure we were under. The gambling debts were getting out of control, and these people were making serious threats. We never meant for it to go this far. This was the first mention of gambling debts, and the admission sent another shockwave through the family. Margaret looked at Frank with horror, clearly realizing he'd just revealed something they'd agreed to keep secret. Gambling debts, Tommy asked, his voice rising. Dad, what gambling debts? You told us you'd stopped playing poker years ago. Frank's shoulders sagged as he realized there was no longer any point in maintaining their lies. I owe $47,000 to some very dangerous people. They gave me until New Year's Eve to pay, and they weren't making idle threats. Using Connor's credit seemed like a temporary solution until we could figure something else out. The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications of Frank's confession. My father hadn't just been stealing my identity for convenience or greed. He'd been trying to avoid physical violence from illegal gambling operations. Margaret wiped her eyes and looked around the table with desperation. Everything we did was to protect this family. Connor's money was like a miracle, and Frank's gambling problem spiraled out of control so quickly. We thought we could fix everything before anyone got hurt. Uncle Richard's face showed disgust as he stood up from the table. You stole your son's identity, destroyed his credit, and put him at risk for crimes he didn't commit. How exactly does that protect anyone? I held up my hand to stop the family argument that was brewing. There's more you all need to know before anyone starts choosing sides. The identity theft and gambling debts were just the beginning of their plan. Margaret and Frank exchanged panicked looks, clearly understanding that I'd discovered something else they'd hoped would remain hidden. The Christmas dinner that had started with lies about my supposed begging for money had become a full confession of crimes, deception, and betrayal that went deeper than anyone had imagined. The next revelation would show just how far my parents had been willing to go to protect their lies, even if it meant destroying my freedom and reputation in the process. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from Jake Morrison, my lawyer friend who specialized in criminal defense. The timing was perfect, almost as if we'd coordinated this moment, though Jake had no idea what was happening at my family's dinner table. Honor, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Jake's voice came through the speaker as I answered the call in front of everyone. But I need to discuss something urgent with you about a conversation I had with your mother last week. Margaret's face went completely white as she realized Jake was about to expose another layer of their conspiracy. She started shaking her head frantically, trying to signal me to end the call, but I kept the phone on speaker so everyone could hear. What kind of conversation, Jake? I asked, maintaining eye contact with my mother. Your mom contacted my office asking hypothetical questions about tax evasion cases and what kind of evidence prosecutors typically need to build cases against individuals involved in financial crimes. She claimed she was asking for a friend, but the questions were very specific to your situation. Uncle Richard leaned forward, his face showing growing alarm. What kind of questions? Jake's voice continued through the speaker. She wanted to know how someone could protect themselves if a family member was being investigated for unreported income, money laundering, or tax fraud. She asked about plea bargaining options and whether cooperation with authorities could reduce sentences for accomplices. The implication hit everyone at the table simultaneously. Margaret hadn't been trying to protect me from investigation. She'd been preparing to throw me under the bus if their crimes were discovered. There's more, Jake continued. Something about her questions bothered me, so I did some preliminary research into your financial situation. Connor, did you know there's an active investigation into suspicious money transfers associated with several shell companies registered in your name EUs? My heart skipped a beat, even though I knew this was part of the plan Jake and I had developed weeks ago. What kind of investigation? The IRS flagged unusual patterns in corporate accounts linked to your Social Security number. Large transfers to multiple individuals, payments to fictional companies, and complex financial structures that look like money laundering operations to investigators who don't understand the context. Frank started sweating profusely as he realized their scheme to frame me had already attracted federal attention. Margaret looked like she might faint as Jake continued explaining the severity of the situation. Based on the evidence patterns, it appears someone has been systematically building a case to make you look like the mastermind of an elaborate financial fraud scheme. The timing is suspicious, Connor. These red flags started appearing right around the time your mother contacted me about hypothetical defense strategies. Katie finally found her voice, though it came out as a horrified whisper. Mom, please tell me you weren't planning to blame Connor for crimes you committed. Margaret's response confirmed everyone's worst fears. We were trying to protect the family, she said through tears. If the authorities discovered the identity theft and gambling connections, it would destroy everyone's lives. We thought if Connor took responsibility, his resources could help him hire better lawyers and avoid serious consequences. The breathtaking selfishness of this logic sent Tommy into a rage. You were going to let your own son go to prison for crimes you committed. How is that protecting anyone? Frank attempted to justify their reasoning. Connor has money and connections. He could have fought the charges successfully. We're older, and prison would destroy us completely. Uncle Richard stood up so violently that his chair fell over. You absolute monsters. You steal from your son, ruin his credit, and then plan to frame him for your crimes because you think he can afford better lawyers. I held up my hand to calm everyone down. Jake, can you tell them about the other evidence you found during your research? Certainly. Connor, your parents have been building documentation to support their fraud narrative for months. They created fake records showing loans they supposedly made to you that were never repaid. They've been telling neighbors and coworkers that you're involved in questionable online business ventures. Most concerning, they've already contacted local police to report suspicious financial activity in your name. Margaret's breakdown intensified as she realized how thoroughly Jake had uncovered their scheme. Frank looked around the table desperately, searching for any family member who might show him sympathy or understanding. The police report portrays you as someone using your family's good reputation to commit financial fraud, Jake continued. According to their statement, you've been manipulating elderly relatives, creating fake charitable organizations, and using identity theft to fund illegal gambling operations. Linda spoke up, her voice filled with disgust. They blamed Connor for Frank's gambling debts. According to the police report, Connor developed the gambling addiction and has been stealing from family members to fund it. Margaret and Frank presented themselves as concerned parents, trying to protect other relatives from their son's criminal behavior. The cruelty of framing me for Frank's gambling problems while simultaneously taking credit for the generosity I'd shown everyone left the entire table speechless. Even Amanda, who had remained quiet throughout most of the dinner, looked at her grandparents with complete revulsion. "Jake, what would have happened if their plan had succeeded?" I asked. "Based on the evidence they've manufactured, you would have faced federal charges for money laundering, tax evasion, identity theft, and wire fraud. The combined sentences could have resulted in 15 to 20 years in federal prison. Meanwhile, your parents would have been portrayed as victims of your manipulation, possibly avoiding any consequences for their actual crimes." Tommy slammed his fist on the table, making all the dishes jump. 20 years in prison for helping his family, while the people who actually committed crimes walked free. Margaret tried one final attempt at justification. "We never wanted it to go that far. We thought the threat of investigation would convince Connor to forgive the debts and help us pay off the gambling creditors. We were going to withdraw the police report once everything was resolved." I looked at my mother with sadness rather than anger. "Mom, you called Jake asking about plea bargains and cooperation agreements. You weren't planning to withdraw anything. You were preparing to testify against me to reduce your own sentences." The weight of their complete betrayal settled over the family like a suffocating blanket. My parents hadn't just stolen from me or lied about their situation. They'd been actively planning to destroy my life to save themselves from consequences they'd created through their own criminal behavior. Katie started crying again, but this time her tears seemed to be for me rather than herself. "Connor, how did you find out about all of this?" I smiled for the first time since dinner began. "Because Jake and I have been working together to document everything for the past 6 months, and we're not the only ones who've been investigating this situation." Margaret and Frank looked at each other with pure terror as they realized their conspiracy had been discovered long before tonight's dinner. The careful planning they thought would save them had instead created evidence of premeditation that would make their legal situation much worse. The Christmas dinner had revealed crimes, lies, and betrayals that went far beyond family financial problems. My parents had been willing to sacrifice my freedom and future to protect themselves from their own mistakes, and now they were about to discover that their scheme had been under professional investigation from the moment they'd started building their case against me. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small recording device, setting it on the table next to my tablet. "This device has been recording every family gathering for the past 2 years, I announced. "Every conversation, every lie, every moment you thought you were manipulating me without consequences." Margaret stared at the recorder in horror while Frank's face showed the dawning realization that they'd been confessing to crimes while being documented. I pressed play, and their voices filled the room, discussing strategies for maintaining their lies and manipulating family members. "That recording from last Thanksgiving where you discussed forging my signature on loan applications, that's federal evidence now. The conversation from Tommy's birthday where you planned to blame me for your gambling debts, also evidence. Every family dinner where you took credit for generosity you never showed while calling me a failure, all documented." Katie looked around the table frantically. "Connor, how long have you known about their plans?" Before I could answer, the doorbell rang. Through the front window, we could see a black SUV parked in the driveway. Margaret started hyperventilating as she realized what was happening. "That would be my bank manager, Sarah, and FBI agent Patricia Walsh," I said calmly, standing up from the table. "I invited them to join us for dessert." Frank tried to stand up, probably planning to run, but Uncle Richard blocked his path. "Sit down, Frank. You've done enough damage tonight." I walked to the front door and let in Sarah Mitchell, my personal banker for the past 3 years, and Agent Patricia Walsh, a federal investigator who specialized in financial fraud cases. Both women carried briefcases and official documentation. "Good evening, everyone," Agent Walsh said, showing her badge to the shocked family members. "I apologize for interrupting your holiday dinner, but we have some important matters to discuss with Margaret and Frank Peterson." Sarah smiled at me warmly. "Connor has been cooperating with our investigation for the past 6 months. His documentation and evidence gathering has been instrumental in building a comprehensive case." I returned to my seat and looked around the table at my stunned relatives. When I first discovered the identity theft, I could have simply reported it and moved on. but something felt wrong about the situation. Why would my parents risk everything for $68,000 when they knew I had resources to help them legitimately? Agent Walsh opened her briefcase and pulled out several thick folders. Mr. Peterson's investigation revealed a complex conspiracy involving not just identity theft, but also money laundering fraud and attempted obstruction of justice. The evidence suggests this wasn't a desperate mistake, but a calculated plan to exploit and manipulate him. Frank finally found his voice. "Connor, you're our son. How could you turn us in to the FBI?" I looked at my father with genuine sadness. "Dad, you reported me to local police for crimes I didn't commit while planning to testify against me in federal court. You were willing to send me to prison for 20 years to save yourself from gambling debts. How is cooperating with an investigation any different from what you already did, Fa?" Sarah pulled out her own documentation and began reading from official bank records. "The Peterson family has been receiving financial support through various shell companies and trusts for 36 months. The total amount exceeds $420,000 in direct payments, loan payoffs, and expense coverage." The family gasped at the enormity of the sum I'd been quietly providing. Even I was surprised by how much it had added up to over 3 years. During this same period, Agent Walsh continued, Margaret and Frank Peterson were accumulating debt in their son's name, creating false documentation to support fraud claims and building a case to frame him for their own criminal activities. Linda shook her head in disbelief. $400,000 of help and they still tried to destroy him. Agent Walsh nodded grimly. The investigation expanded when we discovered the gambling debts were owed to illegal bookmaking operations with connections to organized crime. Mr. Peterson's evidence helped us identify and arrest several individuals involved in illegal gambling and loan sharking activities. This revelation surprised me since I hadn't known the full scope of what Agent Walsh's investigation had uncovered. Frank's gambling problem had apparently connected our family to criminal organizations I never suspected existed. The evidence Mr. Peterson provided also revealed that his parents had been planning this frame job for months, Sarah added. They created detailed financial records designed to make him appear guilty of money laundering and tax evasion. The sophistication of their scheme suggests premeditation rather than desperation. Tommy looked at his parents with complete disgust. "You spent months planning to destroy Connor while he was anonymously paying our bills and saving our lives." Margaret tried one last desperate plea. "Connor, we're your parents. Surely you can find it in your heart to forgive us and work this out privately. We'll pay back everything we owe and get Frank help for his gambling problem." Agent Walsh interrupted before I could respond. "Mrs. Peterson, forgiveness doesn't eliminate federal crimes. Your son's cooperation has already prevented multiple financial crimes and helped us arrest dangerous criminals. The investigation will proceed regardless of family reconciliation." I pulled out a flash drive and handed it to Agent Walsh. "This contains every financial transaction, every recorded conversation, and every piece of evidence I've gathered over the past 6 months. It also includes security camera footage from this house, showing my parents forging documents and discussing their plans." Frank's face went completely white. "Security cameras, Connor, we never gave you permission to put cameras in our house. Actually, Dad, I paid for this house's security system 2 years ago after your gambling associates made threats against the family. I've been protecting you from dangers you created while you were planning to frame me for those same dangers." The irony wasn't lost on anyone at the table. I'd been secretly safeguarding my family from criminal threats while they were secretly planning to blame me for creating those threats. Agent Walsh stood up and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "Margaret and Frank Peterson, you're under arrest for identity theft, conspiracy to commit fraud, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent." As my parents were being read their rights, I made one final announcement that surprised everyone, including Agent Walsh and Sarah. "Despite everything that's happened tonight, I've established a legal defense fund that will cover their attorney fees and ensure they receive competent representation. I've also set up a trust that will continue paying their basic living expenses while they navigate the legal system. Margaret looked at me through her tears, finally understanding that even after their complete betrayal, I wasn't going to abandon them to face their consequences alone. Frank's shoulders shook as he realized the son he'd tried to sacrifice was still protecting him from the harshest consequences of his own actions. Agent Walsh paused in her arrest procedure, clearly surprised by my generosity toward people who had tried to destroy my life. "Mr. Peterson, are you certain you want to provide financial support for individuals who attempted to frame you for federal crimes?" I nodded firmly. "They're still my parents, Agent Walsh. Loving someone doesn't mean accepting their behavior or avoiding consequences. It means ensuring they have the resources to face those consequences with dignity and the possibility of redemption." The Christmas dinner had become a federal arrest, but it had also become something else entirely. A demonstration that justice and mercy could coexist even in the face of unthinkable betrayal. The sight of my parents being handcuffed in their own dining room created a surreal atmosphere that none of us would ever forget. Margaret kept looking back at me with tears streaming down her face, while Frank stared at the floor, unable to make eye contact with anyone. Agent Walsh explained the immediate process as she prepared to escort them to the federal detention facility. "You'll be processed tonight and have arraignment hearings tomorrow morning. The charges include conspiracy, identity theft, wire fraud, and attempted obstruction of justice." Katie stood up suddenly, panic evident in her voice. "Agent Walsh, what about the rest of us? Are we going to be arrested too?" The investigation shows that most family members were victims of manipulation rather than willing participants. However, Katie Peterson and Linda Peterson may face questioning about their knowledge of the identity theft and fraudulent activities. Linda started crying again, realizing that her fake medical emergencies might have legal consequences. Tommy put his arm around her protectively, but his own face showed worry about potential charges. "I want everyone to understand something important," I said, addressing my family directly. "The legal defense fund I mentioned covers Katie and Linda as well. Nobody in this family will face these charges without proper legal representation." Uncle Richard shook his head in amazement. "Connor, after everything they've done to you, you're still protecting them." Before I could answer, Agent Walsh provided additional context that surprised everyone. Mr. Peterson's cooperation actually protected his family from much more serious charges. When we first discovered the gambling connection, the investigation could have expanded to include money laundering and racketeering charges against anyone who benefited from the illegal proceeds. Sarah opened another folder from her briefcase. Connor's evidence showed that family members were unaware of the criminal source of some payments. Without his documentation proving their innocence, several relatives could have faced federal conspiracy charges. The revelation that my investigation had actually protected my family from worse consequences created a moment of stunned silence. Even as they'd been planning to betray me, I'd been working to shield them from criminal liability they didn't even know existed. Frank finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "Son, why would you protect people who tried to destroy you?" I looked at my father as Agent Walsh waited patiently for our conversation to conclude. "Because protecting people from consequences they don't deserve is different from protecting them from consequences they do deserve. You and Mom need to face justice for your choices, but you don't deserve to be homeless or defenseless while you do it." Margaret broke down completely at this point, sobbing as she realized the depth of generosity I'd shown even in the face of their ultimate betrayal. "Connor, I'm so sorry. We were so scared and stupid. We thought we were protecting everyone, but we were just making everything worse." Agent Walsh gently guided my parents toward the door, but she paused to address the family. "For what it's worth, your son's character throughout this investigation has been extraordinary. He could have pursued maximum penalties and civil damages that would have destroyed your family financially. Instead, he's chosen a path that allows for justice while preserving the possibility of redemption." As my parents were led outside to the federal vehicle, I realized this moment represented both an ending and a beginning. The lies that had poisoned our family relationships for 3 years were finally being exposed, but the foundation for rebuilding those relationships on honest terms was also being established. Jessica arrived just as the federal SUV was pulling out of the driveway. I'd called her earlier in the evening, knowing I would need emotional support after this confrontation. She hugged me tightly as we watched my parents disappear into the night. "How are you holding up?" she asked softly. "Better than I expected," I replied honestly. "The truth is finally out there. Everything that happens next can be built on honesty instead of lies." Katie approached us hesitantly, her face showing shame and regret. "Connor, I need you to know how sorry I am for staying silent about the credit cards. I was scared and selfish, and I let them convince me that you wouldn't be hurt by their plans." I looked at my sister, seeing genuine remorse in her expression. "Katie, we've all made mistakes during this situation. What matters now is whether we choose to learn from them and do better going forward." Tommy joined our conversation, bringing Linda with him. "Connor, we want to pay back every penny you've given us. It might take years, but we're going to get real jobs and earn the money to repay your generosity." "I don't need you to repay anything," I replied. "But I do need you to commit to building lives you can be proud of without depending on secrets or manipulation." Uncle Richard was the last family member to approach me before leaving. "Connor, I've watched you handle this situation with more grace and wisdom than men twice your age. Your parents raised a remarkable son, even if they lost sight of that somewhere along the way." Sarah and Agent Walsh remained behind to finalize some paperwork and discuss next steps. Agent Walsh explained that the gambling ring investigation had led to several arrests beyond my parents' case, potentially disrupting criminal operations that had been threatening multiple families in the Denver area. "Your evidence didn't just protect your family," she said. "It helped us shut down loan sharks who were victimizing vulnerable people throughout the region." As the evening wound down and family members headed home to process everything that had happened, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. The pain of my parents' betrayal was real and deep, but it was balanced by relief that the truth was finally exposed and justice was being pursued. Jessica and I sat alone in the dining room where this confrontation had begun, surrounded by the remnants of a Christmas dinner that had become something far more significant. The dishes still needed to be cleared, the leftovers needed to be stored, and life needed to continue, despite the dramatic changes this evening had brought. "What happens next?" Jessica asked. I looked around the room where I'd grown up, where I'd shared countless family meals, and where I'd just watched my parents get arrested for trying to destroy my life. Despite everything that had happened, I felt hopeful about the future. "Now, we rebuild everything on a foundation of truth instead of lies," I said. "It's going to be difficult and painful, but it's also going to be real, in a way our family relationships haven't been for 3 years." The Christmas dinner that had started with lies about my supposed failures had ended with the complete exposure of 3 years of deception, manipulation, and betrayal. But it had also demonstrated that love and justice could coexist, that consequences and mercy weren't mutually exclusive, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their destructive choices while ensuring they have the resources to make better ones. The next chapter of our family story would be written in courtrooms and therapy sessions through honest conversations and difficult reconciliations. But for the first time in 3 years, that story would be based on truth rather than carefully constructed lies, and that made all the difference in the world. 6 months later, I walked through the minimum security federal facility in Colorado, where my parents were serving their sentences. The contrast between this environment and our Christmas dinner table couldn't have been more stark. But the conversations I was about to have would be far more honest than anything we'd shared in years. Frank met me in the visiting room, looking healthier than I'd seen him in years. The mandatory addiction counseling and structured environment had helped him address not just his gambling problem, but also the underlying depression and anxiety that had contributed to his destructive choices. "Connor," he said, standing to embrace me. "Thank you for continuing to visit. I wasn't sure you'd ever want to see me again after everything I put you through." I sat across from him at the small plastic table, noting how different he seemed from the desperate man who'd been arrested 6 months earlier. "Dad, you're still my father. That doesn't excuse what you did, but it doesn't disappear either." Frank nodded, his eyes showing a clarity I hadn't seen since before his gambling addiction took hold. I've been working with a counselor here to understand how my problems affected everyone else. I never realized how my lies forced your mother to lie, which forced Katie and Linda to lie until our whole family was built on deception. The counselor helped me write something for you. He continued, pulling out a handwritten letter. It's not an excuse or a justification. It's an acknowledgement of the specific ways I hurt you, and a plan for how I want to rebuild our relationship based on complete honesty. I read the letter carefully, moved by the detailed accountability it contained. Frank had listed every lie he'd told, every manipulation he'd attempted, and every moment when he'd chosen his addiction over his family's well-being. More importantly, he'd outlined specific steps he planned to take to demonstrate change behavior when he was released. Margaret joined us after completing her afternoon work assignment in the facility's kitchen. Like Frank, she appeared healthier and more grounded than she'd been in years. The stress of maintaining elaborate lies had taken a toll on her that I hadn't fully recognized until seeing her without that burden. "Connor, sweetheart," she said, sitting down beside Frank. "I've been attending group therapy sessions with other women who've made similar mistakes. Hearing their stories helped me understand that what we did to you wasn't protection or love. It was abuse disguised as family loyalty." She pulled out her own letter, this one even longer than Frank's. "I wrote down every lie I told about you, every time I took credit for your generosity, and every moment when I chose our reputation over your well-being. I also wrote about the person I want to be when I get out of here." Reading Margaret's letter was emotionally challenging because it forced me to confront how systematically they'd undermined my self-esteem while benefiting from my success. But it was also healing because it represented the first time my mother had taken complete responsibility for her choices without trying to justify them. "We understand if you can't forgive us," Frank said quietly. "But we want you to know that we're committed to earning back your trust through our actions, not our words." I looked at both of my parents, seeing genuine remorse and accountability that had been absent for years. "I've already forgiven you," I said. "Not because you've earned it, but because holding on to anger was hurting me more than it was helping anyone else. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or accepting repeat behavior, but it does mean choosing to move forward without carrying hatred." Margaret started crying, but these were tears of relief rather than manipulation. "We don't deserve your forgiveness, but we're grateful for it." "You're right that you don't deserve it," I agreed. But forgiveness isn't about what people deserve. It's about choosing healing over resentment and growth over punishment. I updated them on the family changes that had occurred during their incarceration. Katie and Brad had both gotten jobs and were working to rebuild their financial independence without depending on external support. Tommy had completed a certification program and was now managing a construction crew, earning enough to support his family legitimately. Linda has been attending therapy to address her pattern of creating fake crises for attention, I explained. She's learning healthier ways to communicate her needs and fears. Tommy's been incredibly supportive throughout her recovery process. Uncle Richard had become my business partner in a new venture focused on helping families recover from financial abuse and addiction-related trauma. Our program provided counseling, financial planning, and legal support for families dealing with situations similar to what we'd experienced. We've already helped 12 families work through issues involving gambling addiction, financial manipulation, and family deception, I told them. Your experience, as painful as it was, is helping other people avoid similar disasters. Margaret smiled through her tears. Something good came out of our mistakes. Something good came out of how we chose to respond to your mistakes, I corrected gently. Your choices created damage, but our family's choice to pursue healing and honesty created the opportunity for positive change. I shared the most significant news for last. Jessica and I had gotten engaged, and she'd specifically requested that Margaret and Frank be included in our wedding planning when they were released. Despite everything that had happened, she wanted them to be part of our celebration because she believed in the possibility of authentic family relationships built on truth. "Jessica sees the people you're becoming, not just the people you were," I explained. She thinks our wedding should represent the beginning of our family's next chapter 1, where everyone gets to participate honestly. Frank shook his head in amazement. Connor, how did we raise a son with this much capacity for forgiveness and grace? I thought about his question carefully before answering. You taught me the importance of family loyalty and taking care of people I love. Your mistakes taught me the difference between healthy loyalty and enabling destructive behavior. I learned that truly loving someone sometimes means setting boundaries and allowing them to face consequences while ensuring they don't face them alone. As our visit concluded, I outlined the practical plans for their reintegration into family life. The Legal Defense Fund had successfully reduced their sentences through cooperation and demonstrated rehabilitation. Margaret would be released in 4 months, Frank in 6. When you get out, you'll have jobs waiting for you through Uncle Richard's construction company, I told them. You'll also have a modest apartment paid for through a trust fund, but you'll be responsible for maintaining it through your own work. No more anonymous gifts or hidden support. Margaret nodded eagerly. We want to earn our way back into this family's respect. We don't want charity anymore. It's not charity, I clarified. It's a foundation that gives you the opportunity to build authentic lives. What you do with that opportunity is entirely up to you. Frank reached across the table and took my hand. Connor, I promise you'll never have to question our honesty again. We've learned the difference between protecting our family and protecting ourselves at our family's expense. Walking out of the federal facility, I felt a sense of completion that had been missing since that Christmas dinner 6 months earlier. Justice had been served, but mercy had also been extended. My parents were facing appropriate consequences for their choices while receiving the support they needed to make better choices going forward. The drive home gave me time to reflect on everything our family had experienced. The pain of discovering my parents' betrayal had been devastating, but it had also created an opportunity for relationships based on truth rather than manipulation. Katie and Tommy had learned to value independence over dependence. Linda had learned to communicate honestly about her needs, and Uncle Richard had found purpose in helping other families avoid similar crises. Most importantly, I'd learned that protecting myself from exploitation didn't require abandoning love or compassion. Setting boundaries and demanding accountability had actually strengthened our family relationships by removing the dishonesty and resentment that had been poisoning them for years. Jessica was waiting for me when I arrived home, eager to hear about my visit with my parents. As I described their progress and our conversation, I realized how much our relationship had been strengthened by navigating this crisis together. She'd seen me at my most vulnerable and hurt, but she'd also seen me choose healing over revenge and growth over resentment. I'm proud of the man you are and the family you're building, she said as we planned our wedding guest list. Your parents made terrible mistakes, but they raised someone with the wisdom to transform those mistakes into opportunities for positive change. 6 months after a Christmas dinner that had exposed 3 years of lies and betrayal, our family was smaller but stronger, poorer in some ways but richer in others. We'd learned that love without boundaries becomes enabling, that forgiveness without consequences becomes permission, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's destructive patterns while maintaining hope for their redemption. The Christmas dinner that had started with lies about my supposed failures had become the foundation for a family built on truth, accountability, and authentic love. Justice had been served, mercy had been extended, and healing had begun. Most importantly, we discovered that protecting yourself from betrayal doesn't require abandoning compassion, and that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the opportunity to face their mistakes and become better people because of them. As I sat in our living room planning a wedding that would celebrate not just Jessica's and my commitment to each other, but our family's commitment to honesty and growth, I realized that sometimes the most devastating betrayals can become the catalyst for the most authentic relationships. The pain of discovering my parents' lies had been real and deep, but the joy of rebuilding our family on a foundation of truth was even deeper and more lasting. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where someone you loved betrayed your trust, and you had to choose between protecting yourself and maintaining the relationship, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how forgiveness and accountability can work together in the comments below. If this story resonated with you or helped you think about your own family relationships differently, please give it a like and share it with someone who might benefit from hearing about the possibility of healing after betrayal. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about overcoming difficult family situations and finding strength in unexpected places. Thank you for letting me share this journey with you, and I hope your own family relationships are built on the kind of truth and love that can weather any storm. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is set boundaries that protect everyone involved while keeping the door open for authentic reconciliation.